Well, good afternoon, and happy Friday for those ones in New Zealand. I think everybody's in New Zealand, and happy level 3 for those ones in Auckland, and for those ones outside of Auckland. Hopefully, they have a really good weekend plan, I would imagine. Today, thank you for joining us for DENTACHAT. And today we have the pleasure to have Dr. Laurie now, and it doesn't go for Lawrence. So Dr. Lawrence joined us from Brisbane for the sunny state. And everybody's very interested today. Here in Auckland is terrible. And I think we have like a southwestern, so it's not warm. Do the jumper, even if it's spring now, right? So Emeritus Professor Lawrence Walsh, specialist in special needs dentistry based at the University of Queensland in Brisbane. He has published extensively in the field of clinical microbiology and infection control, and he has been conducting studies on water treatment and ozone for over 20 years. So that's nearly my age, just gonna say, right? So obviously he knows what we're gonna talk about today, which is ozone in the water and how can this improve in our day-to-day in the practice. So thank you so much, Laurie, and I will, let you be, let it be.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Rudy. Okay, just put my screen up and here we go. Good. So it's great to spend some time talking with our friends across the ditch. I'm suffering from fairly severe deprivation of New Zealand because I like to go there several times a year. So I've certainly got some pent-up demand from my side. So today's topic is ozonated water, what the technology is and how you would use it in a clinical setting. While I hold a range of patents and different technologies, including in water treatment, not specifically in ozone, so I don't have any conflicts of interest to declare to you in that regard. So let's work our way through the science and also how we actually make it into a practical application in dentistry and where we would use it. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about what ozone is and what it does to different sorts of microorganisms, and then how do we actually make it practical and deliver it in a dental practice environment. So ozone's been known about for a long time, since the 1800s, when Schonbein gave it its name from the Greek word which basically means to smell or to scent, because you've all smelt ozone after electrical storm and things like that. And he was electrolyzing water, and that's how it was originally generated. And of course, we can generate ozone from high voltage discharges. It's called corona discharge, and I've built multiple devices myself in my lab here at home to do exactly that. But you can also do it with electrolytic technology using platinum electrodes, which is actually a very commonly used way of doing it. You can take pure oxygen and expose that to UVC lamps. I've got those lamps here at home. I can do that as well. So there's a few different ways of basically pulling normal oxygen apart and allowing it to recombine, and that's how you get ozone. But because it's inherently unstable, it converts back to normal diatomic oxygen really quickly. And that means you need to basically make it when you need it. You can't put it in a gas cylinder like CO2 or oxygen gas. It has a short half-life. And if you look at the vertical scale over here, which is the reduction in the ozone concentration, you can see that the ozone starts to go off with time. And we often describe at normal room temperature and a neutral pH that the ozone's got a half-life of about 15 to 20 minutes. And you can see there's that 50% coming in at about 15 to 20 minutes. In fact, the half-life is affected by the pH as well. So if you change the pH, if you elevate that, the pH elevation reduces the half-life, and if you drop the pH, that increases the half-life, and so on. But basically, it's not going to be hanging around for more effectively than roughly 30 minutes. That's a reasonably good number to keep in the back of your mind. There are ways of making it slightly more stable in water. If you compare tap water, which is the blue line on this curve, With deionized water, it lasts longer in deionized water. And if you put water through ion exchange columns to remove the ions, obviously that will increase the half-life, and a company called Tersano has commercialized that. And this is why these ozone preparations actually have half-lives of around about 2 hours as opposed to 15 minutes. And this particular piece of research, as you can probably gauge, was done at the University of Queensland. And I'll come back to the reason why later on, but it was basically to develop UAV technology, unmanned aerial vehicles, to spray aqueous ozone to treat areas that were hotspots for COVID, which is a really practical way of using this sort of technology. But more about that later on. Let's look at bacteria and then viruses. So it's highly effective for bacteria because it's a very potent oxidant. It basically destroys and denatures enzymes, and it upsets and damages cell membranes. It also damages the outside of viruses and protozoa. And that's been known about for a very, very long time. It will interact with bacterial spores as well, and it will also destroy those. And this is why it's been used to treat drinking water in Europe for over 100 years, then in Australia, then in the USA, and then more recently in New Zealand. So there are quite a number of municipalities in New Zealand where ozonation is the way the water treatment is actually done in order to disinfect it. Water treatment around the world is pretty much exactly the same sorts of things. So it's chlorine or chloramines and ozone, and it's been approved in many countries and certainly in Australia for many years to treat drinking water. And in fact, in Brisbane, we're having an unusually dry spell. So 1/3 of the water which we're getting at the moment is recycled sewage, which has been treated with ozone, and that's been blended with water from some dams at the Gold Coast and some desal water. When you compare ozone to other sorts of treatments like conventional chlorine in water or chloramines or chloramine dioxide, it has a number of advantages. It works very quickly. It's relatively easy to do. It's very quickly bactericidal and virucidal, and it doesn't give you any residues afterwards, because at the end of the day, all you get is just regular, everyday diatomic oxygen. So that's a good feature about ozone. So not surprisingly, it's been used in wastewater treatment. It's been used extensively in food and livestock industries. It's been used as a commercial disinfectant in preparing different sorts of pharmaceuticals, for example. And of course, it's been used in healthcare and medicine, and still is today very widely around the world. In food treatment, it's the way that bottled water is produced. So every time you've had bottled water, you've had water which has been ozonated. That's why bottled water can stay safely tucked away in a bottle for months or even years and not grow biofilms and become undrinkable. Whereas regular tap water, if you put that in a bottle and put the lid on it, it would be undrinkable within a fairly short matter of days. It's been used to wash down and disinfect food because it can inactivate bacteria and viruses. It also breaks down pesticide residue, which is very useful when you're treating different sorts of market garden products. This is a couple of pictures taken at Rockpool, which is a famous restaurant in Sydney, way too expensive for my taste. And here are some examples of the large water ozonators that feed these nozzles that are used to basically spray down all the seafood coming in, the lettuce, the vegetables, and so on. And that also not only improves hygiene, it also reduces odors and smells. And that's another reason why ozone's used in lots of these environments. Here is the same thing, but basically shrunk down and stuck underneath the cupboard in a dental clinic. So there's a deionizing system, and then there's the water ozonator, which is this, and then that connects through to the taps and is plumbed into the dental chair. So this is an example of a permanent installation for ozonation. The idea of wiping out bacteria and viruses with ozone is a very old idea. And I thought I would contextualize that by putting in a paper from the 1970s. Of course, at this stage of my life, I was in high school a long time ago. And this was looking at the way that you could actually potentiate what water does in ozone with different forms of agitation. For example, sound energy. We've used ultrasound in some of our studies. So the idea of potentiating it by changing the flow dynamics of the water has been around for a fairly long time as well. Here's a much more recent paper published only a couple of weeks ago, looking at the effect of ozone on some really key indicator bacteria. E. coli as an indicator of fecal contamination or coliforms, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which is a ubiquitous pathogen that's waterborne that causes very nasty respiratory and wound infections and is found in most suction lines of dental chairs, by the way. Staph aureus, which of course is also known as MRSA. It's one of the multiple resistant organisms in the community. So is E. faecalis and the fungus Candida albicans. And what they show, which is very, very typical, and we do a lot of this sort of work when we're developing new technologies to treat water, we spike the water with different indicator organisms like Staph aureus or E. faecalis. And then we look at the reduction, the amount that are killed within a certain period of time. So using ozone concentrations here from 0.4 up to 0.8 ppm, they basically wiped out all of the Staph aureus very effectively at high inoculums, medium inoculums, and low inoculum. And it was exactly the same for E. faecalis. When they did coliforms, they found that the very, very high dose of coliforms wasn't inactivated quite as well as the moderate to low doses. And this was in the treatment time that they were using. And if you extend the treatment time, you can actually get all the coliforms knocked out as well. And there's an important dynamic about treatment time and concentration with ozone and how it works and also how it's generated. So if you've got something being generated in water, if the water flows more slowly, you get more ozone. So it's more potent and therefore it needs less time to work. So the benefit of a slower flowing ozone generator is you generate ozone in water that works faster. And the reverse is true. If you have high flow of water through your ozone generator, you get less ozone in the water and it takes longer to get the same level of treatment. And it's all to do with the mass dilution effect of how much ozone is actually present, the dose in a very simplistic way. Pseudomonas aeruginosa, by the way, is actually rapidly inactivated. And that's the reason why some people actually tip some ozonated water into their suction system and down their spittoon, because it's one of the major producers of odors in suction systems. Here's some nice SEMs just showing you some candida. These are the blastocanidia, all the individual cells. Here we've got some coliforms, E. coli, and here's some Staph aureus looking in their normal way. And then this is what happens after exposure to ozone in tap water. And you can start to see how the shape of the bacteria begins to become distorted, and they basically just get broken down into small bits and pieces as the ozone attacks all the membrane lipids and proteins, and eventually even the microbial DNA itself is destroyed. Not surprisingly, because of its broad spectrum action, it's been used to treat sewage. And this, of course, is what we've been doing in Brisbane for many years. And in fact, many countries around the world retreat their sewage with ozone in order to convert it back to drinking water. And this indicates to you that it's very good at wiping out the viruses that are found in sewage, like hepatitis A and E, rotaviruses, poliovirus, and norovirus. And these are tough nuts to inactivate, because unlike viruses like HIV or SARS, which are relatively big viruses with lipid on the outside that's fairly fragile, these organisms in sewage are tough. They don't have lipids on the outside, they've got protein, so they're really difficult to treat. So something that wipes them out will wipe out all the easier viruses as well. So how does it wipe out viruses? Well, the envelope of big viruses like herpes and HIV, for example, or coronaviruses, it gets oxidized, and also all the nucleic acids get attacked. In the tough nuts that are hard to kill, which are coated by protein, it basically diffuses through the protein core and then damages all the viral DNA. So they're unable to incorporate that into your host cells. It also messes up on both big and small viruses, all the receptors on the outside. And when you mess up the receptors, you're unable to bind the virus to a human cell and cause an infection. So that's a really effective and useful strategy. There's lots of papers that have been published on the even smaller viruses known as bacteriophages, of which there's roughly 10 to the 37, so 10 with 37 zeros in the environment. And in the Institute of Molecular Biosciences, where I collaborate and work with a number of other microbiologists, we've done quite a bit of work in testing out what we can do with different sorts of bacteriophages. These are the viruses that infect bacteria. They have very interesting shapes. They look a little bit like a mosquito. So you've probably seen pictures of bacteriophages, but that's also wiped out very, very well by using ozone, which is great. Norovirus is a very important virus to know about because it causes lots of disease. There was an outbreak reported in a large scout camp yesterday, and I was watching this with one of my sons sitting in front of the television, and they began the news report by describing the symptoms in this scout camp, and I turned to him and said, "I bet you this is a norovirus." And they got to the end of the report and they finally said that this was a norovirus. He looked at me and sort of shook his head, you know, typical dad, you know, being able to work out what it was. These cause a lot of outbreaks on cruise ships, in nursing homes, in many long stay facilities. And there's good evidence now that you can wipe out norovirus using ozonated water. And in fact, it's such an interesting topic that last year I was commissioned to write a literature review covering all of the recent literature on destroying norovirus and also Clostridium difficile, which are the spores of a very tough organism that cause outbreaks of diarrhea in nursing homes and aged care facilities and rest homes and places like that. And more than 99% of norovirus you can wipe out with 1 ppm of ozone within 2 minutes, just in ordinary cold or hot tap water. So it's highly effective. And if you're interested, you can drop me an email or you can contact Mint Devices in Australia and they can send you a copy of this article. Now, when it comes to COVID, ozone research has absolutely exploded in the last 2 years, as you can probably imagine, both for using ozone gas for wide area disinfection of areas when there are no people present. And in fact, this is how UVC lights work. They generate ozone. So for area type disinfection, there's been quite a bit of work published around that. And there's also been work on aqueous ozone. And this is where the UQ team have come to the fore. So while one can take ozonated water and spray it around, it's actually very efficient to do this with unmanned aerial vehicles and simply spray them around in these patterns where they simply sweep over the area. And that's a great example of how you can actually inactivate COVID in an area using something where there is no byproducts, where there's no odor, and where you're not leaving any residue behind. So this paper from May 2021 is a great recent piece of research just showing the technology. And what they show beautifully is if you simply spray around water, the amount of reduction you get in the viable amount of SARS-CoV-2 on the surface, of course, isn't anything to write home about. And then as you increase the concentration, once you get to about 0.4 ppm, you get significant inactivation. And when you wind the concentration up to around 1, then you really get a massive killing effect. And this is consistent with what's been shown before in the literature for coronaviruses and also for other viruses using water. But I thought it was just really clever, the concept of an unmanned aerial spraying vehicle. So let's now, in the second part of the presentation, talk about, okay, well, that's all fine. It works. It's been known about for a long time. Lots of places use it. How do you convert that into something practical in a dental practice? And this is something I've thought a lot about, having built a lot of ozone generating equipment in my life. Fortunately, before I did dentistry, I worked in high voltage electronics, so I was quite used to dealing with corona discharge devices and things like that. I wouldn't recommend any of you attempt to work with 50 or 100,000 volts, you know, at home trying to generate ozone. Please don't do that. So the first thing is, if you're going to have something connected to your reticulated water system, then in Australia and New Zealand, it needs to be watermark approved. That means it's got a national stamp of approval for a plumber to legally connect it to your water system. A plumber will lose their license if they connect permanently a device to a water system that isn't watermarked. So that's an important piece of Australian and New Zealand law and standards that you need to be aware about. So the most common implementation in Australia has been the Kona infection control tap, often referred to in short as the KIC tap, KIC. And it's basically a simple sensor tap where the generator and the controller is a little tiny box that sits underneath the sink. And there's a sensor on the tap, which you simply wave your hand about and it works. But you can also implement it as a self-contained spray bottle system. So you've got the electrical generator and a pump basically built into essentially an oversized spray and wipe type of device. There's a couple of those on the market in Australia. And there's also the full-blown underbench continuous flow delivery systems that will treat an entire practice. And all these things are available, but most people have just found the simple tap is the easiest way to go. And they've been widely used in Australia. And many practices have bought them because of the issues around COVID. So these sensor taps can be used for hand washing, and that's obvious. But there's a few other things you can do with the water that comes out of these taps, which is ozonated water. You can use that to feed your dental unit because it's a source of water that's been sterilized. So you're not providing new inoculating bacteria into your dental chair, which is very useful. You can flush freshly ozonated water through your dental chair and it'll actually help remove biofilm. And I've been working a lot with some periodontal specialist practices in Sydney where they've had obviously issues during the lockdown with biofilm building up inside their dental chairs. So we have implemented some protocols around a greater frequency of flushing the ozonated water freshly made through the dental chair. And we've got colony counts on plates which show the benefit of that. It's been used as an irrigant in periodontal therapy after debridement and also in endodontics. And we've published some work on that, including how it can be activated in various ways. There's a quite interesting story around using it as a pre-procedural mouth rinse for people who don't want a commercial mouth rinse. There's many pieces, and if you're in the New Zealand Dental Association, you would have read a couple of months ago the long piece I wrote about pre-procedural mouth rinses in COVID, which was in the NZDA bulletin of February this year. So there's a whole story around that as a mouth rinse. And you can also, of course, wipe it on surfaces, which is, again, a fairly obvious application. So it's actually a reasonably simple thing to do for your plumber. You open the box, there's a tap with some fittings and gaskets and bits and pieces. As you'd expect, there's a couple of connecting pipes that are flexible, and there's a little box that's all wrapped up. The little box is the electronics, which requires some low voltage to drive it. That operates the sensor and actually does the electrolysis. Because water electrolyzes at 1.23 volts, you don't need mains voltage to break water down. You only need 1.23 volts. So when you do that with a platinum electrode and a catalyst, you can easily electrolyze water at less than 2 volts. So it's a very easy and very safe thing to do electronically. So the control box is just normally mounted underneath the sink, and then it feeds up through the dispensing tap. So some people have implemented this by simply saying, here's my existing sink, let's just drill a hole beside that and put this on as an extra tap. So the first two examples just show you where we've got some simple flick operated taps, and they've simply just popped a hole in the side and mounted the KIC tap on the left-hand side. Or you might have an all stainless steel set up like this, and this is an example on the right-hand side, or you might have Corian and you drill a hole for that. It doesn't really matter. There's lots of ways you can just simply add it on to your existing taps. And again, that's something that your plumber can do. You can replace existing taps with a KIC tap. And that's what these three examples here are. So you take your existing flick mixer tap out and you simply replace that with your sensor tap. The third thing you can do is if you've got a scrub sink, so if you do lots of implants, oral surgery in your practice, then you can add this onto your scrub sink. And that's what these examples are showing here. And if you looked at the notes that I sent around before the lecture, you would have seen a link to a YouTube, which shows you some of these different configurations and installations. That was put together by Mint Devices, who are the importer in Australia. Now, in terms of hand hygiene, very interesting to compare and contrast ozonated water to alcohol-based hand gel. And there is a test for the performance of hand gel, which is known as the EN 1500, the European norm 1500. It uses coliforms put on the skin and looks at their reduction. When I was doing some of my training in the US, we actually conducted studies using hand print cultures into large culture plates when we were testing out some early formulas of alcohol-based hand gel. This was over 35 years ago, so the idea is a fairly old idea. So here's a really neat study from Norway where the reason for the study was that there were several eye surgeons in this hospital who developed quite bad dermatitis. And as a result of broken skin, they were unable to continue doing surgical work. So they were really interested in a solution that might allow them to disinfect their hands, but also to continue work. So what they did was they linked up with the local nursing school and they recruited 30 of the nursing students to test in each of the subjects the difference between alcohol-based hand gel and ozonated water. So it was a crossover study. So each of the 30 nursing students used both protocols, and they used both products for 30 seconds with 3 mils of alcohol-based hand gel, and they used 2 concentrations of ozonated tap water. One was a high flow unit, so the ppm was relatively low. The other one was a low flow unit, so the ppm was relatively high. But the total dose was pretty much the same. And they then used the EN 1500 test method. And what they did was, which was really clever, was they show the results for each individual person in those 30. So there were some people who had massive levels of bacteria present despite using alcohol-based hand gel, but those people actually had no organisms left after using ozonated water. There were some people who had very high levels of bacteria, but had a lot less if they were using ozonated water. And of course, there were many people who were 0 or negative. So you can see there's a fairly wide range of results, and that's why I'm actually showing you the raw data. What they concluded was that ozonated tap water was highly effective for getting rid of coliforms from the skin, which is the benchmark test for it. And that would have application not only in healthcare, but would also have application in public places. Now, when they looked at hand irritation in this group of 30 people, they found that 1 in 5 of the students, so 6 of them, did actually get a bit of dryness and skin irritation and burning from the alcohol-based hand gel product that they were using, but no one got those reactions. And hence they concluded at the end of their study that ozonated water might be useful for people who do have dermatological problems because it's going to be less irritant to the skin. So that I thought was a very interesting aspect that's not often thought about. Now, when you are using ozonated water, you will normally smell some ozone. So the threshold for nasal detection of ozone does vary slightly between different people, but it's normal for roughly 3 out of 4 people to actually be able to smell a sub 1 part per million dose of ozone in water. And you do get some ambient ozone in the air that obviously breaks down, as I've said, in sort of 15 minutes to half an hour. And it's the amount you get is 1/10 below the working exposure level for people who are working a 40-hour working week, which is basically set up by the work health and safety legislation for people who do arc welding. So people who are boilermakers, for example. And I spent some of my life working in that and doing professional welding, building farm equipment, for example, where you spend 6 or 7 hours a day welding, and you actually get to inhale a fair bit of ozone as a result. So there are limits on that. So the amount you get from transiently turning on a tap to wash your hands with liquid soap is basically insignificant. It's 1/10 of the working dose for an 8-hour day. And as I mentioned earlier, the water flow makes a difference. So when you slow the flow rate down, the ozone level goes up and vice versa. So when ozone taps are installed, there's a check done for the available ozone level using a portable meter called an AWP meter, which obviously I have one of, working in ozone and use it all the time. There have been other studies which have compared ozonated water to quaternary ammonium compounds like benzalkonium chloride, and also just with straight liquid soap, showing that it's really good at getting bacteria off the skin. So that's a fairly well developed area of technology. And there's, of course, places, particularly in Australia, where nursing homes have implemented ozonated water at several stations around the nursing home, so that the staff members don't move the norovirus from the room of one resident to the room of another. Because it's well documented, and you can read more about this in my literature review about how staff can transfer norovirus around, and it won't be inactivated by alcohol-based hand gel. And that's the reason why it can spread so quickly, because people think that hand gel is enough, but norovirus is well and truly up to the challenge of alcohol-based hand gel, and so are the spores of Clostridium difficile. So that's one of the reasons why, obviously, in my specialty, we go into nursing homes. We have two big projects that are based in nursing homes at the moment that I'm involved with. So clearly, this is a practical issue that we have to face. And then as an independent water source, if you've got your ozonated water coming out of a tap, where could you put it? So obvious applications I've already mentioned are into your dental unit, down your spittoon, and down your suction line. But you might have devices that have self-contained water system. So you might have a benchtop ultrasonic scaler with a water reservoir or a chemical reservoir on it, and you can put ozonated water into that. A number of our periodontists in Sydney deliver the ozone that way, freshly made. So while they're using ultrasonic scaler, they're getting the effect of ozone at the same time. And that can enhance healing, and it obviously elevates oxygen tension, which is great for eliminating gram-negative strict anaerobic bacteria that, of course, are the pathogens in periodontal disease. You can use it in particle jet cleaners. You can use it in oral irrigators. If you have an oral irrigator at home, for example, or in your practice, they are notorious for growing large amounts of Legionella. That's why we don't allow them in the oncology units of our hospital, because they generally spray Legionella everywhere, which is a big problem. Whereas if you're feeding that with ozonated water, you're feeding it with sterile water, and the freshly ozonated water actually removes the biofilm, which is a really useful thing to know. So there's lots of things, and I've covered many of these in the review that I've written recently about all the applications of ozonated water, just based on the last 3 or 4 years of publications in the literature. That article is called "Let the Recent Evidence Speak," and you might want to go to that to basically get a snapshot or a synopsis of all the recent research that has been done, looking at antimicrobial actions, looking at all these different clinical places where, once you've got an ozonated water system in your practice, things that you can also use it for that maybe you hadn't thought about doing in the first place. If you are thinking about trying to use ozonated water to bleach teeth, we've done a lot of research on that. I hate to tell you the concentration is not high enough. You would need to elevate it quite substantially, and you need some quite interesting technology in order to do that in a bleaching gel. So please don't think about it as a substitution for bleaching. It's quite not that concentrated at the way it comes out of a tap, but there are other ways to do it, of course. So most people would just use it in their self-contained water bottle on their chair. They would use it down their suction lines. They would tip it down their spittoon to reduce odors. They would still be using, an oral towel or a pulley jet or some other product as well, because those other products have got other components that you need. They've got things that dissolve mineral scale, and they've often got enzymes or broad-spectrum antimicrobials that help. So you can't just eliminate the use of your professional suction cleaners, but you can dramatically reduce problems like odor from a suction line by using ozonated water. In fact, a former Prime Minister of Australia, Paul Keating, often referred to as the Undertaker, has several large commercial piggeries. And like many piggeries do, they actually spray ozonated water in the air to reduce the odor from all the pigs. So there's a big literature around odor mitigating using ozone and ozonated water. And then finally, there are other things you can use it for. So you can use it to disinfect items of lab work, for example, impressions, dentures. If you've put something like a contour rim or an appliance on a study model and it's contaminated with saliva, you can decontaminate a study model using ozonated water. So there's lots of things that you can potentially think about, and they're pretty much all covered in that recent literature review. So if you want to look there, I'd certainly recommend that. So that's the story. I've tried to sort of compact it down into a very sort of practical sense for you, but obviously there's a lot of publications in this field, and I look forward to taking your questions. Thanks very much, and I'll pass back over to Rudy. Thanks, Rudy.
Thank you so much, Laurie. That was very interesting, and I think we all need to think twice next time we're in Brisbane and drink water from the tap. I think everybody was kind of thinking that. So I have a question. So if you know how you kind of clean that often, all the pipes and the little hoses and everything on your dental unit, with using this, will that reduce the times that you have to do it, or do you still need to do the same procedure? Or
yeah, that's a really good question, Rudy. So there's a paper I've written, which is all the recent literature on suction lines, which is coming out in about 2 months' time. So I'm just going to refer to water lines because they have slightly different biofilm environments. The suction lines are a rich nutrient biofilm, and the dental unit water lines are a sparse nutrient biofilm, and we've grown those in our lab for many years to test out different strategies. What you will find in a dental unit is that during a period of reduced activity, so over a weekend, during public holiday, during lockdowns, those sorts of things, the water stagnates, and ozonated water will help to break up biofilm and remove it. But if you've got a lot of calcifications that are starting to occur, then you might need to actually use one of the professional shock treatment agents, because they contain mineral chelators, things like EDTA, for example, and they will help break up some of the more dense and mineralized biofilm that you can get in tubing. Ozonated water isn't that great against mineralized biofilm. So if you use it as a mouth rinse, it won't get rid of your calculus, for example, even though it might reduce some of your plaque. That's just one example. So if you have got a dental unit which is brand new, obviously, ideally, you feed it with sterile water that's been ozonated from the beginning, and you never build up a biofilm. But in reality, that rarely happens. So most people have been using some sort of chemical agent like ICX or Dentocept, for example, or Oxygenel as an additive to treat their water chemically. That can reduce the growth of organisms, but remember that every time you're putting further tap water in, you're re-inoculating your dental chair. So the nice thing about using ozonated water as your feed is you're not putting new bacteria in, because like the bottled water that you drink, you've now got rid of the organisms. So you can use it in combination. You simply put the bottled water is ozonated, then you can put in your additive, and then you end up with sterile water and no biofilm. And that gives you an ideal scenario. And if you're looking at a situation where the chair is being used less, then you don't have organisms that are actively growing. So it's a great way of handling it. So really good question. Thanks, Rudy.
No worries. Yeah, so, there you go.
Laurie, out of the kick tap, what's the concentration of ppm?
Remember I said how that'll obviously vary on what your local water pressure is, the way the plumber has connected it, and what the flow rate is. And that's why it's normally tested at installation to see what you get. So you might have your kick tap set to a fairly fast flow rate, in which case the level might be something like 0.4 or 0.6. Or you might decide you want to turn down a bit so it's actually more gentle and makes less splash and less noise, in which case you might find that you're getting 1 or maybe 1.2 or something like that. So that's actually tweaked individually. And I was doing some work with a practice this week in Sydney, and we're literally tweaking the water levels up or down to regulate the level. So it's going to be in the sort of ppm range, but it will depend on the flow rate, and that will depend on your local water pressure, which will depend on, where you live, the altitude of the nearest water tower, the whole range of water system things that, that would determine that. So, but you're basically looking at somewhere that's going to be greater than 0.1, which is basically your minimum level to start wiping things out, and less than probably 10. So it's going to be in that range, but it will vary according to the flow rate. Hopefully that makes sense to you.
Yeah, it seemed from the research there wasn't a lot of advantage going above 1 ppm.
Exactly right. So all the research shows that the only thing that you gain by going higher is if you are treating industrial effluent, for example, that the treatment time is less. But in reality, all the water-based applications tend to sit around the 0.4 to 1. That's exactly right.
Okay.
Right. Any questions? Any more questions? If you guys have any questions, put on the chat. Otherwise, Laurie, well, thank you so much for the presentation. And that was very interesting. And I mean, this is the second time I've heard about the Ozone, and yeah, it's pretty amazing things you can do. So it's pretty cool. And so somebody's asking me who's selling ozone treatments machines in New Zealand. Well, us. So if you have I'm going to send an email just after this with the slides and then an article that Laurie just mentioned before, and I'm also putting the CPD point there. And yeah, there's also like a little information about the Kona tabs that we have available. If you have any other further questions about the particular tabs, just contact the equipment guys and they will be able to help you. So there's another question there. So is it safe to drink in staff water bottles?
Yes, so we don't generally advise people to, drink freshly ozonated water. It won't actually reach your GI tract to upset it because of the pH fluctuations as it goes through your stomach. But what it will do is it will strip some of the saliva of your esophagus on the way down by a prolytic action, which is why we tell people you probably don't want to be drinking this regularly, but you can use it to make bottled water. So if you've got, water bottles, you can certainly, put ozonated water into those, and you won't even smell the ozone after about half an hour. So that's a very, very easy thing to do. But most of the time, if you're using it as a mouth rinse, for example, with a patient, then you would obviously use it fresh. But you'd always tell the patient that there's going to be a faint odor, and patients generally don't either notice or they're not sort of concerned about it. Obviously, the taste is very bland. There's nothing interesting about the taste of ozonated water. So if you've got patients who don't like mouth rinsing because they're worried about burning or stinging or something, then this solves all those problems. And that's why in Australia, one of the recommendations in the list of accepted mouth rinses is the commercial products with the relevant active ingredients and ozonated water that's freshly made.
Right, cool.
So how long do patients rinse for a pre-procedural rinse? 20 seconds is the minimum time and 30 seconds is the maximum. If you just tell people to rinse, they'll generally rinse for about 5 to 10 seconds. So you need to actually count them through to the 20-second period, because you'll find that most of the research that's been published on reductions of viral load in the mouth has been done using a 20 to 30-second rinse. Okay. Because it's not irritant, it's no problem. It's not like using a high alcohol rinse where you start to burn after about 15 seconds. There's nothing that's going to cause any irritation. So you can just switch it around as much as you want.
So, Laurie, you know how in one of the protocols here in Dental Council is to pre-rinse do the COVID,
yeah,
and
right.
And then you do it, and there's some, I don't know how much studies about how much affect your product if you're doing chlorhexidine, how much that will affect with you bonding your cements or peroxide, etc. Peroxide has obviously oxygen, so would that affect the bonding?
That's really good question.
Use this instead.
Yeah, so there have been studies done looking at Oxygenel and DentoCept and ICX, which are all contain hydrogen peroxide, and they all show that the amount that you have when it's coming through the spray of your triplex or through your high-speed handpiece doesn't affect bond strengths to enamel or dentine. That literature is a reasonably big literature. So trace amounts of hydrogen peroxide which convert into oxygen radicals in water don't affect bond strength like that. And again, freshly ozonated water, you're unlikely to have someone mouth rinse and then immediately pick up something and try to bond it to their enamel. Procedure, I can't see how that would happen. So there's always going to be a delay. And in that time, the elevated temperature of the mouth and the pH in the mouth will have converted the oxygen radicals back. There's a defense system in the saliva which does that. And the ambient conditions will convert the ozone back to oxygen gas. So effectively, you won't have any left in the mouth after about 10 minutes anyway. If you go looking for it, you basically can't find it. And this is the reason why when we developed bleaching technologies using ozone, you had to make it the instant before you need it, because after 10 minutes, it was all gone. So we know that from having researched it from a different angle. So no, you won't get problems with bond strength or anything like that in the normal use environment situations that you could expect in a dental practice.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for that. It looks like there's no more questions, but a lot of thank you. So thank you again, Laurie. Happy Friday for you in the sunny state. And we'll, happy Friday for everybody outside of the lockdown in Auckland. And for those ones in Auckland, well, we'll enjoy takeaways, I guess. So, yeah.
Lovely. All right. Thank you very much. Great to talk with you. Cheerio. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.